They handed me a violation notice for my own boat, docked at my own pier, on my own property. The HOA president, a woman with a smile as thin as her patience, explained that my modest fishing boat was an unapproved vessel and had to be moved within 7 days or I would face heavy fines. She spoke with an air of absolute authority, confident that her binder of rules gave her dominion over my life. They thought they had all the power, the bylaws, the fines, the threats. But in their rush to enforce their petty tyranny, they overlooked one catastrophic detail. They never bothered to ask who actually owned the lake they were so desperate to control. Moving into the house I'd inherited from my grandfather felt like coming home to a place I'd only ever known in sepia-toned photographs and fond, distant memories. It wasn't a modern mansion, but a modest, sturdy home with a sprawling backyard that melted into the shoreline of a serene, private lake. That lake was my grandfather's pride and joy. For 50 years, he'd been its sole owner and caretaker, a fact documented in dusty county records but mostly forgotten by the world. He believed the water was a gift, a sanctuary of peace, and he had a quiet, informal agreement with the handful of neighbors who originally lived here: treat it with respect, and you're welcome to fish. The neighborhood, now called Maple Creek, had grown up around the lake. It was the very picture of suburban tranquility. Manicured lawns were a point of pride, neighbors exchanged friendly waves during evening walks, and the homeowners association seemed, at first glance, to be a benign force for good. They organized the annual summer barbecue, managed the landscaping of the communal entrance, and sent out polite newsletters about lawn care. For the first year, I lived in quiet contentment. I paid my dues on time, kept my yard neat, and enjoyed the solitude my property afforded me. My life was simple: work, home, and quiet weekends spent on my back porch, watching the sun glitter on the water his grandfather had so carefully preserved. The change was gradual, almost unnoticeable at first. It began when a new president was elected to the HOA board. Her name was Carol. I'd seen her around, a woman who carried a clipboard on her daily walks and seemed to view every blade of grass as a potential violation. The friendly newsletters began to take on a sharper tone. New rules, pages and pages of them, were suddenly ratified in sparsely attended meetings. The regulations grew increasingly specific and restrictive, covering everything from the approved shade of front door paint to the maximum height of garden gnomes. A sense of unease began to permeate the neighborhood's friendly facade. The quiet, unspoken trust that had defined this community for decades was being replaced by a culture of rigid, top-down control. It was against this backdrop that I decided to honor my grandfather's memory in my own way. In his old garage, under a dusty tarp, was his fishing boat. It was a simple, 14-foot aluminum vessel, far from the sleek, modern speedboats some neighbors owned. Over several months, I lovingly restored it. I patched the hull, sanded the worn wooden seats, and gave it a fresh coat of forest green paint. It wasn't a yacht, but it was a piece of my family's history, a tangible link to the man who had given me this incredible inheritance. The first time I took it out on the water, a wave of profound peace washed over me. It felt right. I moored it at the small, private dock my grandfather had built, the same dock that had stood there for half a century. It was barely visible from the street, a quiet testament to a simpler time. A few of the older residents smiled when they saw it, telling me how much it reminded them of my grandfather. But Carol and her new board members never saw a piece of history. They only saw something old, something that didn't fit their vision of a perfectly uniform, modern community. I was blissfully unaware that my small act of remembrance had just placed me directly in their crosshairs. My peaceful existence was about to be shattered by a single, folded piece of paper left on my doorstep. The formal letter arrived 2 days later. My polite, carefully worded explanation about the boat's history and my dock's private status was dismissed in a single, condescending paragraph. They stated that under Bylaw 7, Section C, any vessel visible from what they termed the community-shared lake was subject to aesthetic review by the Architectural Committee. My appeal was denied. Tucked inside the envelope was a printed invoice for a $100 fine, with a note that the penalty would double every 7 days of noncompliance. The phrase that stuck with me, that echoed in my mind, was, community shared lake. It was a foundational error, a crack in the very premise of their authority, but I wasn't ready to show my hand just yet. I filed the letter away, paid the fine to buy myself time, and waited. The next move came not in writing, but in person. Carol seemed to materialize next to my mailbox one afternoon, holding a pair of pruning shears and wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She spoke about the importance of community cohesion and protecting property values. She gestured vaguely toward my dock, mentioning that a few neighbors had expressed concerns about the rustic aesthetic of my boat. It was a masterclass in passive aggression. She never raised her voice, but her message was clear: my personal tribute to my grandfather was an eyesore, a blemish on her perfect suburban canvas. Then came the insult veiled as a helpful suggestion. She mentioned the Maple Creek Fishing Club, a group of residents who held tournaments on the lake every weekend. She noted how they all used a specific, board-approved model of modern base boat, and perhaps I should consider joining them. The implication was sickening: abandon my grandfather's legacy and get in line. A week later, the HOA's monthly newsletter was delivered. Tucked between a recipe for pot roast and a reminder about lawn aeration was a new section titled Neighborhood Watch. It was an anonymous column about the importance of maintaining a premium and standardized appearance throughout Maple Creek. It spoke of the dangers of letting even one property fall into disrepair, warning about derelict items and unapproved structures that could create a domino effect of declining home values. It never mentioned me by name, but it didn't have to. Every word was aimed directly at me. It was public shaming disguised as community service. My neighbors, people I'd waved to just days before, were now reading this propaganda, and I could feel the subtle shift in the air. The friendly waves became hesitant, the smiles a little tighter. I was being quietly, systematically isolated. The second fine arrived on schedule. It was for $250, and this time it was accompanied by a letter from the HOA's legal counsel. The language was colder, sharper. It mentioned the possibility of placing a lien against my property for continued violations. This was no longer about a neighborhood disagreement, it was an existential threat to the home my grandfather had left me. That night, the frustration that had been simmering within me finally hardened into cold resolve. I wasn't dealing with reasonable people, I was dealing with bullies who had draped themselves in the cheap fabric of official procedure. The time for polite letters was over. I spent the entire weekend in my grandfather's dusty office, a room I hadn't touched since I moved in. I opened the old filing cabinet, the metallic screech echoing in the silent house. And there it was. A thick, leather-bound portfolio containing every document related to the property. I carefully spread the contents across the large oak desk, the original land grant from the 1950s, decades of property tax receipts, and the official county survey maps. Underneath it all was the master document, the one that changed everything, the legally recorded deed. I traced the property lines with my finger on the surveyor's map. My property didn't just end at the shoreline. It extended across the entire lake, encompassing every square inch of the lake bed, the water, and the shoreline on the other side. Then, I found the file on the Maple Creek HOA. My grandfather, a meticulous man, had kept a copy of their original incorporation documents and bylaws from when they were first established. I read the fine print, my heart pounding in my chest. Their jurisdiction, their entire scope of power, was explicitly defined by the platted residential lots of the Maple Creek subdivision. My property, which predated the subdivision by 30 years, was referenced only as an adjacent parcel. Their authority, according to their own founding documents, ended precisely where my lawn met the dirt. They had absolutely no legal power over my dock, my boat, or one single drop of water in my lake. They had been acting on an assumption of power they simply did not possess. I sat back in the creaking leather chair, the weight of the past few weeks lifting, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. I had the truth. The question now was what to do with it. Before I could formulate a plan, my opponents made the final, fatal error. An envelope appeared in my mailbox, this one bearing the logo of the Maple Creek Fishing Club. It was a formal complaint. Their president, a man who was also the HOA's treasurer, wrote that my permanently moored vessel was creating a navigational hazard during their weekend tournaments. They demanded I remove it immediately to ensure the unfettered enjoyment of the lake for club members. The audacity was breathtaking. This club, which had been using my private property for free for years, was now demanding I remove my personal boat from my own dock for their convenience. That Saturday, I watched them from my porch. I saw them cast their lines, heard their loud conversations echo across the water, and watched them leave behind a trail of discarded fishing line and empty soda cans on the shore. They treated my grandfather's sanctuary like their personal playground. They weren't neighbors enjoying a shared resource, they were invaders who felt a sense of entitlement to something they never owned. The letter from the fishing club, combined with the HOA's legal threat and the public shaming, crystallized my purpose. This was no longer about defending my boat. It was about reclaiming a legacy. I walked back to my grandfather's office, the deed in one hand and the fishing club's demand in the other. Their entire world, their rules, their club, their tournaments, was built on a lie. And I was about to tear it all down. The notice for the annual Maple Creek HOA meeting was the opportunity one had been waiting for. It was the perfect stage, not a private office or a sterile courtroom, but a public forum where the entire community would be present to witness the outcome. Carol and her board thrived on the power of perception, on the illusion of unanimous support. I decided, then and there, that I would dismantle that illusion in front of everyone they purported to represent. My week was consumed with methodical, meticulous preparation. I wasn't just planning an argument, I was preparing for a siege. I made dozens of copies of every crucial document, the original deed clearly stating my sole ownership of the lake, the official county surveyor's map with my property lines highlighted in bold yellow, and the HOA's own bylaws, with the article defining their jurisdiction circled in red. I visited a local print shop and had the surveyor's map blown up into a massive, 3x4-foot poster that was impossible to ignore. I took my grandfather's old camera and spent an afternoon documenting the aftermath of a fishing club tournament, taking high-resolution photos of the beer cans, tangled fishing line, and discarded food wrappers that littered the shoreline my family had kept pristine for decades. The final step was the most important. I consulted with a property lawyer, a quiet, sharp man who confirmed my position was legally unassailable. He drafted 2 documents for me. The first was a formal cease and desist letter, demanding the HOA immediately halt all enforcement actions against me, retract all fines, and issue a formal apology for their harassment. The second was a notice of trespass and revocation of permissive use, a document that would legally and officially revoke the 5-decade-long informal permission for residents to use the lake. My hands didn't even shake as I signed them. I was past fear, all that remained was a cold, hard sense of purpose. The community clubhouse was buzzing with the low hum of neighborhood chatter. Carol stood at a podium at the front of the room, radiating an aura of absolute control. The meeting droned on with budget reports and landscaping updates. Then, Carol paused, looked down at her notes, and her lips curled into a faint smirk. She announced a new agenda item, aggressive collection of delinquent accounts. Without using my name, she launched into a 5-minute lecture on the importance of every resident doing their part, and how the board had a zero-tolerance policy for those who ignored violations and refused to pay their fines. She spoke of liens and legal action, all while periodically glancing in my direction. The pressure was immense, a palpable weight in the room. This was the pinnacle of her power trip, an attempt to publicly humiliate me into submission. She thought she was delivering the final blow. In reality, she was setting the stage for her own downfall. Finally, she moved to the open forum, asking condescendingly if anyone had any minor issues to discuss. I stood up. A hush fell over the room. Every eye turned toward me. I walked slowly, deliberately, from the back of the room to the front, carrying my portfolio and the large, rolled-up poster. I could feel Carol's glare, a mixture of annoyance and surprise. She opened her mouth to stop me, but I didn't give her the chance. I calmly placed the large poster on an easel next to her podium and unrolled it. It was the map. The bright yellow highlighter tracing my property line seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, a stark, undeniable boundary that encircled the entire lake. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke in a calm, measured tone, narrating the history of my family's ownership. Then, I began to hand out the document packets to the silent, watching residents. In your hands, I announced to the room, you will find a copy of the recorded deed for my property. You will also find a copy of this association's own bylaws, with Article 2, Section 1, highlighted. A wave of rustling paper filled the room. I saw faces lean in, eyes scanning the documents. I saw husbands and wives whispering to each other. I saw the moment of realization dawn on face after face. It was the quietest explosion I had ever witnessed. As you can plainly see, I continued, my voice cutting through the silence, this HOA's legal jurisdiction ends at my property line. It does not, and has never, included the lake. I turned the page on the easel to reveal the photos of the garbage left behind by the fishing club. I described the 50 years of goodwill my grandfather had extended, allowing his neighbors to enjoy his private sanctuary. I spoke of the respect he had asked for in return, and the blatant disrespect that had replaced it. The room was deathly quiet. Carol was ashen-faced, her smug confidence completely evaporated, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. The president of the fishing club, who was also the HOA treasurer, looked like he'd been punched. And then, I delivered the final, decisive blow. I walked directly up to the podium and placed the cease and desist letter squarely in front of Carol. I then turned and handed the notice of trespass to the fishing club president. I turned back to the crowd. The harassment, the fines, and the threat stop tonight, I stated, my voice echoing in the stunned silence. Furthermore, effective immediately, the permissive use of the lake is revoked. The lake is now closed to all non-residents of my property. Anyone found on the water or the shoreline will be considered a trespasser and will be treated accordingly. A wave of gasps and angry murmurs rippled through the room. They had taken it all for granted, and now it was gone. I had not only proven them wrong, I had taken away their most prized community feature. I didn't wait for the questions, for the arguments, for the inevitable explosion of outrage. My work there was done. I looked at Carol one last time, her reign of petty tyranny shattered. This is the consequence of your actions, I said, my voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. Then I turned, walked out of the clubhouse, and didn't look back, leaving behind the chaos and the rubble of an empire built on a lie. The drive home was the quietest 5 minutes of my life. I expected my hands to be shaking, my heart to be racing, but a profound sense of calm had settled over me. I had walked into that clubhouse as a defendant, but I had walked out as the victor, leaving a firestorm in my wake. The silence in my car was a stark contrast to the pandemonium I knew was erupting behind me. My phone started buzzing almost immediately, a cascade of notifications from the neighborhood social media page. I ignored it. That was their world, their problem. My world was here, in the quiet solitude of my grandfather's house, looking out over the dark, still water of my lake. The days that followed were a study in human nature. The first tangible response came from the HOA. It was not a phone call or a personal visit, but a sterile, legally vetted letter slipped into my mailbox. It was a masterpiece of corporate apology, acknowledging their misunderstanding regarding the property lines and formally rescinding all fines and violations. There was no mention of the harassment, no apology for the public shaming, just a cold, clinical admission of their error. They were trying to cauterize a wound they had inflicted, desperate to avoid a lawsuit. I filed the letter away with the others. It was a trophy of sorts, a testament to their capitulation. The next morning, I hired a local handyman to help me install a series of simple but elegant signs along the shoreline. They were made of dark wood, with "private property, no trespassing," routed in clean, white letters. We placed one at every point where a neighbor's yard met my property line, and a larger one at the main path the fishing club had always used. It wasn't a fence or a wall, it was a clear, unambiguous statement. The era of assumed privilege was over. The weekends, once filled with the roar of boat motors and the loud jeers of the fishing tournaments, fell completely silent. The change was palpable. I could sit on my back porch and hear the birds, the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. The peace my grandfather had cherished had finally returned. But peace on my property did not mean peace in the neighborhood. The community had fractured. The online forums, which I finally brought myself to read, were a battlefield. One faction, led by the former fishing club members, vilified me. They called me selfish, petty, and spiteful. They accused me of punishing an entire community for the actions of a few, conveniently forgetting their own role in the escalation. But a second, more powerful faction rose in opposition. Their anger was directed squarely at Carol and her disgraced board. The story of the meeting had spread like wildfire, embellished with every telling. Residents I had never spoken to were now defending me, not because they knew me, but because they understood the principle. They saw the board's actions for what they were, a reckless abuse of power. They realized that the HOA's arrogance had cost them their most beloved amenity. Homeowners began posting about their own petty run-ins with Carol, their own ridiculous fines for trivial matters. The narrative had shifted. I was no longer the villain, I was the catalyst. The curtain had been pulled back, revealing the petty tyrants for what they truly were. The fallout for the board was swift and brutal. A petition for a special meeting to hold a vote of no confidence circulated, gaining the required signatures in less than 48 hours. Carol, seeing the writing on the wall, resigned via a short, bitter email before the meeting could even take place. The treasurer, the former fishing club president, and the rest of her board followed suit within the hour. Their reign, built on a foundation of intimidation and meticulously crafted bylaws, had crumbled to dust in less than a week. An interim board was formed, composed of some of the neighborhood's oldest and most respected residents. A few weeks later, my doorbell rang. On my porch stood a man in his late 70s, someone I recognized from my grandfather's old photographs. He was the new HOA president. He wasn't holding a clipboard or a violation notice, just an expression of weary regret. He apologized, sincerely and without reservation, for what I had been put through. He didn't ask me to reopen the lake. He simply asked if we could, in time, find a way to be neighbors again. That conversation started a long process of thought for me. I spent many evenings in my grandfather's boat, drifting in the center of the silent lake, pondering his legacy. He hadn't guarded this place out of selfishness, he had protected it out of love. He believed it was a sanctuary, and the informal permission he had extended to his original neighbors was based on a foundation of mutual respect that had long since eroded. The problem was never about sharing the water, it was about the entitlement and disrespect that had poisoned the privilege. I decided to honor my grandfather's spirit, but in a way that protected his legacy for the future. I drafted a new document, a lake stewardship agreement. I invited a handful of the families who had been my neighbors for years, the ones who had offered quiet smiles when they saw my grandfather's boat back on the water, to sign it. The rules were simple and non-negotiable. No motorized boats. No large groups. Pack out everything you pack in. Access was a privilege, granted on an annual basis, and could be revoked by me, at my sole discretion, for any reason. It was not an HOA amenity. It was a personal agreement between neighbors, built on trust. A year has passed since that chaotic meeting. The community is quieter now, calmer. The new HOA is focused on its actual duties, maintaining the common areas and fostering a sense of community, not policing it. The house prices didn't fall, in fact, the neighborhood's reputation for tranquility has made it more desirable. Sometimes, on a Saturday morning, I'll see one of my neighbors out on the water in a canoe, casting a line in the morning mist. They always offer a quiet wave, a gesture of thanks, and I wave back. The lake is once again a sanctuary, not a battleground. My grandfather's boat remains moored at his dock, a silent guardian of his memory. I had been pushed into a conflict I never wanted, but in defending my home, I had rediscovered the true meaning of his inheritance. It wasn't about the land or the water, it was about the unshakable peace that comes from standing your ground. They thought their power came from a binder of rules, but true power comes from the truth, and a deed to a lake is a truth that's hard to ignore.